She thought the room was too loud for anyone to hear the threat. The music was playing, wine glasses were touching, and every rich guest in the restaurant was smiling like nothing ugly could ever happen under golden lights. Then her ex-boyfriend leaned close and whispered in Italian, "Smile, Clara. If you make a scene, your son will disappear before the check arrives." He believed no one understood him. He believed fear was safest when it was hidden inside a beautiful language. But at the next table sat a man he never expected a mafia boss who understood every single word. And from that one sentence, a woman's private nightmare became a war over truth, power, and survival. Welcome to a channel about mafia boss stories, where some people are born to dominate, but the greatest lessons are not taught in school. They are learned in silence, betrayal, loyalty, discipline, and the hidden rooms behind real power. This channel does not glorify crime. It tells stories about mindset, courage, control, and the price of true authority. Tonight's story teaches us this: being afraid does not make you weak. Staying calm, keeping proof, and choosing the right moment to speak can change everything. If this story pulls you in, like, comment where you're watching from, share it with someone who loves powerful stories, and subscribe for more mafia boss lessons hidden inside unforgettable drama.
The first thing Clara Bennett noticed was the music, not the people, not the flowers, not the expensive wine being poured into glasses that cost more than her electric bill. The music. A string quartet sat near the tall front windows of Vieri S, playing something soft and old. The kind of song rich people liked because it made the room feel more civilized than it really was. The violin rose gently over the sound of laughter, silverware, and polite conversations about charity. Every table glowed under warm amber lights. Every guest seemed polished. Every smile looked practiced. Clara stood near the host station, with a black clipboard pressed against her chest and a pen tucked behind one ear. Her dress was simple, black, and practical. Her brown hair was pinned low at the back of her neck. She had spent the last 4 hours making sure the evening looked effortless for people who would never know her name. Table 6 needed gluten-free pasta. Table 9 had a donor who hated being seated near the kitchen. The city councilman's wife wanted sparkling water. No ice. The photographer had already been warned not to take pictures of the retired judge from his left side. Clara knew these things because that was her job. She kept the room running. She kept disasters small. She made other people comfortable. She had become very good at that. Then the front doors opened, and Matteo Vieri walked in. The room changed for him. It was subtle, but Clara felt it in her bones before she let herself look up. The manager straightened his jacket. 2 waiters stepped aside. A woman in pearls smiled before Matteo even reached her. Men who liked to believe they were powerful offered their hands to him first. Matteo was handsome in the way expensive things were handsome. Dark hair, silver at the temples, navy suit perfectly tailored, white shirt open at the throat, just enough to seem relaxed. His smile was warm, controlled, and deadly familiar to everyone in that room. Matteo Vieri was a successful restaurant owner, a generous donor, a man who remembered birthdays and sent flowers to widows. He was the kind of man people described as charming because they had never been alone with him after the charm turned cold. Clara looked down at her clipboard. She told herself to breathe. He had no reason to speak to her tonight. The event was almost over. She could keep moving, keep working, keep her face calm. She had survived nearly a year without him. She could survive one more evening in the same room. Clara. His voice was soft. Of course it was. Matteo never raised his voice when other people could hear him. She turned slowly. Mr. Vieri. His smile widened a little, as if he enjoyed the formality. So cold. After everything working. Yes, he said. I can see that. He stepped closer. Not too close. Just close enough for no one to question it. Close enough that anyone watching would assume an old acquaintance was sharing a private word. Close enough that Clara could smell his cologne, the same expensive scent he used to wear when he apologized after making her cry. Her hand tightened around the clipboard. Please don't do this here, she said quietly. Matteo tilted his head. Do what? That was one of his favorite games. Make her name the thing, make her sound dramatic, make her seem fascinable. Clara looked past him, toward the dining room. Guests were laughing. Someone lifted a glass. The quartet moved into a sweeter melody. No one was looking at her. No one ever looked at the right moment. Matteo leaned closer, smiling as if he were complimenting the evening. Then he spoke in Italian. Sorridi, Clara, se fai una scena. Tuo figlio sparirà, prima che arrivi il conto. Smile, Clara. If you make a scene, your son will disappear before the check arrives. The room did not stop. That was the cruelest part. The music continued. A woman at the nearest table laughed at something her husband said. A waiter passed with a tray of tiramisu. Somewhere near the bar, a man asked for another glass of Barolo. The world kept moving. Because the world had not understood. Clara had. For 1 second, she could not feel her hands. Ethan. Her son was at the campus library tonight. He had texted her an hour ago to say he was studying late. He was 18, almost grown. Still careless with his jacket, still leaving cereal bowls in the sink. Still the only thing in Clara's life that made the future feel worth fighting for. Matteo watched her absorb the threat. His smile did not change. That was when, at the table beside them, a glass of water touched the white tablecloth. It was not loud. It was barely a sound at all. But Matteo heard it. So did Clara. The man at the next table had been sitting with two others, half turned away from the room. He wore a charcoal suit without a wrinkle, a white shirt, and no tie. His hair was dark with gray at the sides. His face was still in a way that did not feel relaxed. It felt disciplined. Clara had noticed him earlier only because the staff seemed nervous around his table. Now he was looking directly at Matteo. The man spoke in Italian. Un uomo che minaccia un figlio davanti a sua madre non è un uomo. È un codardo con una bella giacca. A man who threatens a child in front of his mother is not a man. He is a coward in a fine jacket. Matteo went very still. Clara turned her head toward the stranger. For a moment, she forgot to be afraid. Shock pushed everything else aside. He had understood every word. The two men at his table stopped eating. One of them, younger and broader through the shoulders, looked ready to stand. The stranger did not move quickly. He did not need to. He placed his napkin beside his plate and rose with the calm of a man who had never once wondered whether a room would make space for him. Only then did Clara understand who he was. Not his name, not yet, but the shape of him. Power recognized power before anyone introduced it. Matteo recovered first. He gave a small laugh, too smooth to be real. Dante, he said in English, this is a private misunderstanding. The man named Dante looked at him. No, he said. His voice was low, even, and clear enough for nearby tables to hear. A misunderstanding is when two people hear different things. I heard exactly what you said. The silence spread outward. A few guests turned. The manager froze near the wine station. Clara felt the blood return to her fingers all at once, hot and painful. Matteo's face did not break, but something behind his eyes did. Anger, embarrassment, calculation. He looked at Clara, and for a fraction of a second she saw what he would have done if the room had been empty. Dante saw it too. Mr. Vieri is leaving, Dante said. No one asked who had given him the right to say it. That frightened Clara almost as much as Matteo did. The manager appeared at Matteo's side, pale and eager to survive the moment. Matteo smiled at the room, adjusted one cuff, and gave a little nod as if he had chosen to leave. Before he turned away, he looked at Clara. The message was clear. This is not over. When he was gone, the music tried to begin again. Conversations restarted in broken pieces. People smiled too brightly and pretended nothing serious had happened. Because pretending was easier than asking what they had just witnessed. Clara stood where she was, her clipboard still pressed to her chest. Dante turned to her, but he did not step closer. That mattered. Most men stepped closer when they wanted to feel useful. He stayed where he was and said, "Does your son have somewhere safe to be tonight?" Clara stared at him. "I don't know who you are." "Good," she blinked. "Good. Good that you don't trust quickly." His answer unsettled her, because it was the first sensible thing any man had said to her all night. The younger man behind him shifted, watching the hallway where Matteo had gone. Dante did not look back. His attention remained on Clara, steady but not possessive. She forced herself to stand straighter. I didn't leave one dangerous man just to follow another. For the first time, something almost like approval crossed Dante's face. No, he said, you should. He reached inside his jacket slowly, making sure she could see the movement, and removed a plain white card. No company name, no title, only a phone number printed in black. He held it out. Clara did not take it. Dante did not push. If he uses your son's name again, he said, call. The card waited between them. At last, Clara took it. His fingers did not touch hers. That mattered too. 30 minutes later, Clara left through the rear entrance and drove home with both hands on the wheel. She called Ethan twice. The first time, he did not answer, and her heart climbed into her throat. The second time, he picked up, annoyed and alive. Mom, I'm studying, just checking, you okay? Clara looked at the road ahead, at the red lights trembling on the wet pavement. Yes, she lied. Her apartment was quiet when she arrived. She locked the door, then locked it again. She checked the windows. She texted Ethan one more time and waited until he sent back a thumbs up. Only then did she see the envelope. It had been pushed under the door. No stamp, no address. Her body knew before her hands did. Inside was a photograph of Ethan crossing the campus lawn, backpack over one shoulder. Head turned slightly as if someone had called his name from a distance. On the back, written in neat Italian, was one sentence. Adesso anche lui è nella conversazione. Now, he is in the conversation too. Clara stood in the middle of her living room, holding the photograph in one hand and Dante Moretti's white card in the other. This time, when her hands began to shake, she did not try to stop them, she called. Dante Moretti answered on the second ring. Clara had expected a machine or a secretary, or the cold distance of a man who gave out phone numbers, the way powerful men gave out favors, not because they meant them, but because it cost nothing to appear generous. But there was no delay, no sleepy confusion, no irritation, just his voice, low and awake, as if he had been expecting the call. Clara. Hearing her name in his voice made the room feel smaller. She stood in the middle of her living room, with the photograph of Ethan in one hand and the white card in the other. Her apartment was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of traffic moving through the wet Chicago streets below. The lamp beside the sofa threw a pale circle of light across the floor. Everything outside that circle seemed too dark. He sent a photo of my son, she said. There was no gasp on Dante's end, no curse, no promise to kill anyone. For reasons Clara did not understand, that made him more frightening and more useful at the same time. Is your son with you now? He asked. No, he's at the campus library. I called him, he answered. How long ago? 3 minutes. Good. Call him again in 10. Tell him you need him home. Dante mentioned Matteo on the phone. Dante, sound afraid if you can help it. Clara closed her eyes. That's easy advice from someone who isn't holding a picture of his child. A pause. Then Dante said, no, it is not easy advice. It is necessary advice. The steadiness in his tone irritated her because it helped. She looked down at the photograph again. Ethan was walking across the campus lawn in his red hoodie, the one with the torn cuff she had asked him to throw away twice. His backpack hung from one shoulder. He looked ordinary, careless, alive. The person who had taken the photograph had been close enough to see him clearly. Far enough that Ethan had not noticed. On the back, Matteo's neat Italian handwriting sat like a stain. Now he is in the conversation too. Clara walked to the kitchen table and set the photo down, face up. Then she placed Dante's card beside it. What do you want me to do? She asked. First, you are going to breathe. I am breathing. No, Dante said. You are surviving. There is a difference. Clara wanted to snap at him, but the truth of the sentence caught somewhere under her ribs. She pulled out a chair and sat before her knees, decided for her. Dante continued, do you have copies of anything Matteo might want? Her eyes moved toward the hallway, toward her bedroom, toward the plastic storage box under the bed. Yes, how many? Enough. A slight change in the silence told her he approved. Do not bring them to me tonight, he said. That surprised her. You don't want them. I want you alive more than I want documents. And if Matteo is watching your building, the worst thing you can do is leave in a panic carrying the one thing he wants. Clara stared at the photograph. Her fingers pressed into the edge of the table until the wood hurt. He thinks I'm stupid, she said quietly. No, Dante answered. He thinks fear makes you stupid. That is a different mistake. For the first time since finding the envelope, Clara looked up. That was Mateo's mistake. Not that he underestimated her intelligence. He knew she was intelligent. That was part of why he had loved controlling her. What he underestimated was what she had become after leaving him. Fear had made Clara careful. Fear had taught her to copy files when Mateo was in the shower. Fear had taught her to screenshot messages before he deleted them from shared accounts. Fear had taught her to mail a sealed envelope to a friend in Milwaukee and another to a former student who worked for a law office downtown. Fear had taught her that one copy was hope, but 3 copies were strategy. I have a USB drive, she said. Bank statements, some old texts, recordings, not everything, but enough to prove he threatened me before. Good. And a spreadsheet. Dante's voice changed, just a little. What kind of spreadsheet? I don't know. Restaurant invoices, I think. Imports, wine, cheese, olive oil. Catering orders. Some of it looked normal, some of it didn't. Why did you copy it? Clara almost laughed. It came out dry and humorless. Because one night, Mateo came into the study and saw me near his laptop. Nothing had happened. I hadn't opened anything yet. I was just putting a charger away. But his face changed. I had lived with him long enough to know what his face meant when something mattered. What did he do? He kissed my forehead. Dante said nothing. Clara swallowed. That was always worse than yelling outside. A car passed too fast through a puddle, spraying water against the curb. Clara listened to it fade after he went to bed. I copied the folder, she said. I didn't even know what I was taking. I just knew he didn't want me near it. That may be why he came tonight. He came tonight because he still thinks I belong to him. Yes, Dante said. And because you may have something that proves he is not as clean as he looks. Clara stood again. Movement helped. If she kept still too long. The fear started filling the room like smoke. I need to get Ethan. Yes. But not alone. Her body tightened. I am not sending one of your men to my son. I did not ask you to. Good. I can have someone watch the entrance from a distance. No contact, no approach, only eyes. No. Dante did not argue. That stopped her more than an argument would have. No, he repeated. No. Not unless I know who it is, where they'll be, and what they allowed to do. Fair. Clara gripped the back of the chair. I mean it. I am not trading one man's control for another man's protection. I heard you the first time. The words were simple. They landed heavily. Clara had not realized how used she was to repeating herself. With Mateo, no boundary counted unless she defended it until she was exhausted. Even then, he treated her exhaustion as consent. Dante did not. That did not make him safe, but it made him different. I will send no one unless you agree, he said. You call your son. You tell him to come home. If he asks why, you say the truth carefully. You say there was a problem at work, and you want him home tonight. Do not mention Mateo's name until he is standing in front of you. And if someone follows him, then you call me back, and we adjust. We, yes, the word stayed with her. Clara Bennett had spent the last year building a life around the word I. I will leave. I will pay the bills. I will protect Ethan. I will not go back. I will not answer that message. I will not cry where he can see it. We felt dangerous. We also felt like a chair placed behind someone who had been standing too long. She picked up her phone and called Ethan. This time, he answered with the full irritation of an 18-year-old who believed mothers were unreasonable by nature. Mom. Seriously. I'm studying, I know, Clara said, keeping her voice level. I need you to come home. Why? There was a problem at work. What kind of problem? Not over the phone. The silence changed. Ethan heard something beneath her calm. He always did. Mom, I'm okay, she said, then. Because she had promised herself one honest answer tonight, she added. But I need you home. I leave now. Stay on the main path. Don T cut through the parking structure. Mom, what is going on? Main path. Ethan. Another pause. Okay. When the call ended, Claire realized Dante had said nothing the entire time. He had not interrupted. He had not instructed. He had simply stayed on the line. He is coming, she said. Good. I'm going to wait downstairs. No. Her spine stiffened. Dante corrected himself immediately. I advise against it. If Mateo has someone watching, you standing outside alone gives them 2 targets instead of 1. Stay behind a locked door until your son is in the building. Clara let the correction pass, not because she missed it, but because he had made it himself. I hate this, she said. I know. No, you don't. For the first time. Dante's voice softened by a degree. I know what it is to hear a threat in a language everyone else thinks is beautiful. Clara went still. She did not ask him what he meant. Not yet. Instead, she carried the phone with her into the bedroom and knelt beside the bed. She pulled out the plastic storage box and opened it. Paper, drives, notes, old fear, organized by date. She took the USB drive from a small envelope taped beneath the lid and held it up under the bedroom light. It looked too small to be dangerous. But Matteo had taught her something useful, though he had never meant to. Men like him feared proof more than tears. I have it, she said. Do not plug it into anything connected to the internet, Dante said. Do not email it, do not text photos of it. Tomorrow we meet somewhere public, somewhere you choose. That mattered too. Public library, Clara said. Second floor, near the reference desk, cameras everywhere. A quiet breath from Dante, almost approval. What time? 10. I'll come alone. I didn't ask you to, you would have, despite everything. Clara almost smiled. Then headlights swept across her bedroom wall. A car had turned into the lot below. She hurried to the window, keeping herself behind the curtain. Ethan crossed the sidewalk a moment later. Hood up, backpack slung over one shoulder. Alive, still annoyed, probably, still hers. Clara's throat closed so hard she could not speak. Dante seemed to understand from her silence. Yes, there. Yes, let him in, lock the door. Then call no one else tonight except someone you trust completely. Clara watched Ethan enter the building. I don't know if that list exists anymore. Then start making a new one. The line went quiet, but Dante did not hang up. Clara looked at the USB in her palm, the photograph on the table, and the door Ethan would walk through in less than a minute. For almost a year, she had believed survival meant keeping the pieces of her fear separate. A little truth here, a little proof there, a little silence everywhere. Tonight, the pieces had begun moving toward one another, and somewhere in the city, Matteo Vieri still believed he had started a conversation. Clara closed her hand around the USB. No, she thought, he had started a record. Clara chose the public library because fear had taught her to love places with exits. The second floor had 3 of them. A stairwell near the elevators, a main staircase facing the reference desk, and a narrow emergency door beside the local history room. There were cameras in the corners, librarians who noticed raised voices, and enough elderly men reading newspapers to make the room feel ordinary. Ordinary mattered. Ordinary was harder to twist into something ugly later. She arrived 20 minutes early. That was another habit Matteo had left behind in her life. Never arrive on time if someone else chose the meeting. Never sit with your back to a door. Never set anything valuable on a table until you know how quickly you can take it back. But today, Clara had chosen the place. She had chosen the time. And still, when Dante Moretti stepped off the elevator at exactly 10 o'clock, her hand closed around the USB drive in her coat pocket. He came alone. That surprised her, though she did not let it show. No broad-shouldered guard beside him. No younger man watching the corners. No performance of power. Just Dante in a dark overcoat, his silver-streaked hair combed back. His expression calm enough to make the room seem louder around him. He saw her before she lifted a hand. Men like Matteo searched for attention. Dante seemed to search for details. He noticed the table she had chosen near the reference desk. He noticed the camera above the computer station. He noticed that Clara had placed her chair so she could see both staircases. His eyes moved once, quietly, then returned to her face. You picked a good room, he said as he sat down. I picked a public one. That is usually what makes it good. Clara studied him across the table. In daylight, away from the golden glow of Matteo's restaurant, Dante looked less like a myth and more like a man who had trained himself not to waste movement. His hands rested on the table, still and empty. He had not brought coffee. He had not brought a folder. He had not brought anyone to impress her. That made him harder to read. She took the USB from her pocket and placed it between them, but kept 2 fingers on it. This is a copy, she said. Dante nodded. Good. You're not going to ask where the original is, if you are smart. I should not know. Clara looked at him for a long second. That was not what Matteo would have said. Matteo would have smiled, praised her cleverness. then asked 3 different ways until she felt rude for not answering. Dante simply accepted the boundary as if it were a closed door. She slid the USB halfway across the table. Dante took a small laptop from inside his coat. It looked new, plain, and disconnected from everything. He did not open it until he had turned the screen slightly so Clara could see. "This machine does not connect to the internet," he said. "Nothing leaves it. I'm supposed to take your word for that." "No," Dante said. "You were supposed to watch." So she watched. He inserted the USB and opened the folder. At first, the files looked like what Clara remembered: invoices, supplier lists, shipment schedules, scanned catering contracts, spreadsheets with boring names. Matteo had always loved boring names. They made dirty things look sleepy. Dante opened the largest spreadsheet and began to read. For several minutes, he said nothing. That was worse than a reaction. Clara watched his eyes move across the rows: wine, olive oil, imported cheese, private dinners, seasonal inventory, numbers arranged so neatly they almost looked honest. Then came the notes in Italian, short phrases, casual words. Things that had looked harmless to Clara until Matteo's face told her they were not. Dante leaned slightly closer. "Tre caspero cugino," he read. "3 boxes for the cousin." Clara translated. "Yes," he said, "but not here. What does it mean? Maybe a cash transfer. Maybe a person. Maybe a shipment that does not exist on paper." He scrolled down. "Cena longa venerdì, long dinner Friday," Clara said. Dante shook his head. "Delay. Or extended holding time. Something waiting longer than scheduled." Another line. "Pane vecchio, porta nuova, old bread, new door." Clara hated that one. She had stared at it many nights after leaving Matteo, wondering why something so simple made the back of her neck go cold. Dante's face hardened. "What?" she asked. "That may mean an old route through a new company." She sat back. For a moment, all the air seemed to leave the table. "So this is not about catering invoices," she said. "No, and it's not just about what he did to me." Dante looked at her then, not with pity. Clara would have hated pity. He looked at her like someone confirming a fact they both had to survive. "No," he said. "This is why he wants you quiet." The word quiet moved through Clara like a hand closing over her mouth. Quiet had been Matteo's favorite version of her. Quiet when he corrected her in front of friends. Quiet when he said she was too sensitive. Quiet when he changed the password to their shared account and told her it was for safety. Quiet when he called 3 times in 10 minutes and then accused her of hiding something because she answered on the fourth. Quiet was the room he built around her. She looked at the spreadsheet. "I don't understand most of it. You understood enough to copy it. That does to make me brave." "No," Dante said. "It makes you alive." The simplicity of it struck her harder than a compliment. Clara pulled her hand back into her lap and clasped it with the other to keep it still. "What happens now? Now we assume Matteo knows you still have this. We assume he knows I hurt him last night. We assume he will try to make you look unstable before anyone can make him look guilty. You sound sure. I have known men like him. So have I." Dante accepted that without argument. Clara leaned forward. "Then hear this clearly. No one follows my son unless I approve it. No one comes into my apartment. No one takes my evidence away from me. No one speaks to police in my name, and you do not kill Matteo." The last sentence sat between them like a blade. Dante did not blink. "Is that what you think I do? I don't know what you do. That's the problem." A woman at a nearby table turned a page in her book, somewhere downstairs. A child laughed too loudly and was hushed by a parent. The normal world continued around them, which somehow made the conversation more dangerous. Dante closed the laptop slowly. "If I make this about blood," he said, "Matteo wins." Clara held his gaze. "He will say you ran from one violent man to another. He will say your evidence is part of my war. He will make every truth you have look like something I bought." She hated how quickly she understood. "So what are you offering? Time, information, protection if you choose it, not ownership." That word landed carefully. Ownership. Matteo had never used it. Men like Matteo rarely named the thing they wanted most. Clara looked toward the reference desk, where a librarian was helping an old man print a bus schedule. She thought about Ethan walking home the night before. She thought about the photograph under the door. She thought about how tired she was of doing every hard thing alone, just to prove no one controlled her. "I want everything copied to my lawyer," she said. Then we get you a lawyer who knows what this is. I have one. You have someone who handles restraining orders and family paperwork. You need someone who knows financial crimes and men who hide behind restaurants. Clara did not like that he was right. I still choose who sees what. Yes, and if I say no, then I leave this library, and you keep my number. She studied him for the lie. She did not find it before she could answer. Her phone vibrated. For one wild second, she thought it was Ethan. It was not. It was a text from a former coworker. Is this about you? Below it was a link. Clara opened it with a strange calm. The kind that sometimes comes when the body has been frightened so many times it stops wasting energy on surprise. Matteo had posted a photograph of himself at the charity dinner. He stood beneath warm lights, one hand over his heart, smiling like a man who gave more than he took. The caption was long, elegant. Wounded. He wrote about betrayal, about false stories, about the pain of being targeted by someone who could not accept the end of a relationship. He wrote about mental instability, without naming Clara. He wrote about forgiveness in a way that made him sound holy. Clara felt something colder than fear settle inside her. He didn't use my name, she said. Dante read the post from across the table. He didn't need to. By noon, more messages came, some kind, some curious, some already choosing Matteo because he looked easier to believe. Clara turned the phone face down, but the damage had already entered the room. Dante's phone rang once. He looked at the screen, then answered. He listened without speaking, then he said, "Bring it to the office. Do not open it." He ended the call. "What?" Clara asked. Dante's expression did not change, but the air around him did. "A bottle of wine was delivered to my office." Clara waited, with a note. What did it say? Dante looked at her. Even men who listen can lose their tongues. For a moment, Clara heard the library differently. The whisper of pages, the soft wheels of a book cart, the small, civilized sounds of a place built for knowledge. Matteo had sent a threat into that world, too. Clara's voice was quiet when she spoke. He knows you heard him, yes, and he's not afraid of you. Dante slipped the laptop back into his coat. No, he said. He is afraid, but someone has made him believe he can afford to be. Clara looked down at her phone, at Matteo's beautiful post, at the first pieces of her reputation beginning to crack in other people's hands. Then she looked at Dante. What do we do? Dante stood calm as ever. Now, he said, we find out who taught him that. By the time Clara got home from the library, Ethan was sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open and no work getting done. He tried to look casual when she walked in. That was the first thing that hurt. 18-year-old boys were not supposed to practice looking casual for their mothers. They were supposed to leave shoes in hallways, drink milk from the carton, and believe danger was something that happened to other people on the news. Clara closed the door behind her and locked it. Once, then again. Ethan watched the second lock turn. Mom, she kept her hand on the deadbolt for a moment longer than she needed to. I know. No, you don't get to say I know and then walk away. He pushed the laptop aside. Something is going on. And don't tell me it's work. I'm not 12. Clara turned around slowly. He looked so much like his father in small ways, though she almost never allowed herself to think that. Not Matteo. Ethan's real father, gone from their lives long before Matteo ever appeared. Same square jaw, same stubborn mouth, same belief that if he loved someone enough, he could stand between them and whatever was coming. That belief was beautiful. It was also dangerous. Clara sat across from him. For a few seconds, she arranged her hands on the table as if she were preparing to teach a class. Maybe she was. Maybe this was the hardest lesson she had ever given. Matteo is not just bothering me, she said. Ethan's face changed immediately. What does that mean? It means he has threatened me, more than once. It means he sent the photograph of you last night, because he wanted me to know he could get close to your life. Ethan went pale beneath his anger. You should have told me. I know. How long? Clara looked at the grain of the table. There was a small scratch near Ethan's elbow from the year he tried to build a model airplane with a steak knife because he could not find the proper tool. He had been 13 then. She had yelled at him for 20 minutes and then cried in the bathroom, where he could not hear her. Long enough, she said. That's not an answer. No, she admitted, it's not. He stood so quickly the chair scraped back. So what? I'm supposed to just go to class and pretend some guy isn't taking pictures of me. No, from now on you tell me where you are. You don't answer unknown numbers. You don't click strange links. You don't meet anyone who says they have information about me. If anything feels wrong, you leave and call me. Ethan stared at her. That sounds like rules for a child. It has a safety plan. It sounds like you re-putting me in a box. Clara's voice cracked before she could stop it. No, Ethan. You are the one thing I cannot afford to lose. That silenced him, for a moment. He was not angry, he was just young. Young enough to be frightened by how frightened she was. He sat down again, slower this time. Why didn't you tell me? Clara swallowed. Because I thought, if I carried it alone, you could still feel normal. His eyes reddened. I don't want normal if it costs you that much. The sentence went through her cleanly. She reached across the table. He hesitated only a second before taking her hand. His hand was bigger than hers now. That still surprised her sometimes. I'm not going to tell you everything tonight, she said. Not because I don't trust you, because some of it needs to be handled carefully. But I promise I won't leave you guessing in the dark anymore. Ethan nodded. He tried to look older than he felt. Is the mafia guy part of this? He asked. Clara almost laughed, but there was no humor in her. His name is Dante. That does answer the question. No, she said, it does the next afternoon. Clara met Dante at a small coffee shop, 3 blocks from the community college where she taught Italian twice a week. She chose the place because the owner knew her, because the front window faced the street, and because the back door opened into an alley she had used once during a fire drill. Old habits again, doors, cameras, witnesses, distance. Dante arrived without Nico. Just as he said he would, he ordered black coffee and did not touch it for the first 5 minutes. Clara noticed that. She noticed too much now. Or maybe she always had, and Matteo had simply taught her to mistrust her own observations. My son knows more, she said. Dante nodded. Good. That is your favorite word. No. It is just rare when people do the wise thing before the desperate thing. Clara looked at him over the rim of her cup. Do you have children? No. Then don't to sound so certain about what's wise when it comes to mine. Dante accepted the correction without offense. That was becoming one of the stranger things about him. He could fill a room with danger. But he did not seem threatened by being challenged. You rewrite, he said. I do not know what it is to be a mother. No, Clara said. You don't. I know what it is to be a child in a house, where adults hide terror inside another language. The words settled between them. Outside. Buses sighed at the curb. A student passed the window with headphones on, laughing at something on his phone. The world kept showing off its normal life, Clara asked. Your father. Dante looked at his coffee. He used Italian when he wanted my mother afraid but not noticed. Around neighbors. Around customers. Around people who thought he was old-fashioned and passionate. His mouth tightened slightly. They thought the language made it romantic. It made it private. Clara looked down. Private, yes. That was exactly the word. Matteo had made cruelty private, even in public rooms. He could say something vicious with a smile and leave Clara standing there, looking rude if she reacted and weak if she did not. Some men use language like a locked room, Dante said. Clara looked up at him. And that night, she said, you opened the door. Dante did not answer right away. Something in his face shifted, not soft enough to be tenderness, not hard enough to be pain. Recognition, maybe. The kind people offer when they cannot fix what happened, only stand beside what it made of you. Before either of them could say more, a woman in a gray coat walked into the coffee shop and came straight to their table. She was in her early 50s, with sharp eyes, neat silver blonde hair, and a leather briefcase that looked more expensive than Clara's car. She did not ask permission before sitting. Clara Bennett, the woman said. Rosa Whittaker. Clara looked at Dante. My attorney, he said. Rosa removed a folder from her briefcase. And today, if you allow it, I'm going to be the person who stops both of you from making stupid emotional decisions. Clara almost liked her immediately. Rosa turned to her. Dante tells me you have messages, recordings, documents, and a financial file. I do. Good. Do not delete anything. Do not edit anything. Do not forward original files casually. Do not respond to Matteo when you are angry, afraid, or tired. If he calls, let it go to voicemail. If he texts, screenshot it with the date visible. Send copies to someone you trust. If he threatens you, document it. If he apologizes, document that too. Men like this build two stories at the same time, the one where they scare you, and the one where they tell everyone else you imagined it. Clara listened carefully. Rosa's voice was not gentle, but it was clean. No pity. No drama, just tools. That sounds like a lot, Clara said. It is. Survival is work. The goal is to make sure the work counts. Dante watched quietly. For once. He seemed content to let someone else lead. Rosa continued. Matteo wants a reaction. He wants you to look unstable. He wants one bad voicemail. One public confrontation. One message that can be cut in half and shown to the right person. Do not give him a version of you he can sell. Clara felt those words settle into the part of her that had wanted to scream since the night before. Do not give him a version of you he can sell. Later, after Rosa left, Dante's phone vibrated. He read the message, and the little warmth that had entered the table disappeared. What? Clara asked. One of Matteo's men was seen near Ethan's campus. Her hand tightened around her cup. Dante was already typing. Nico wants to take him. Take him where? Dante looked at her, and his silence answered. No, Clara said. I know, he called Nico anyway, putting the phone to his ear. Clara could hear only Dante's side. No, you watch. You do not touch him. You do not speak to him. You do not follow him off a public street. A pause. Because if you scare him. Matteo says Clara hired criminals to intimidate people. Another pause, longer this time. Protecting her means thinking past your anger. He ended the call. Clara realized she had been holding her breath. Dante placed the phone face down. He will listen, does he always? No, that's comforting, honest. A small, exhausted smile almost reached her face. Then her own phone buzzed. Unknown sender. For a moment she considered not looking. Then Rosa's voice echoed in her mind. Document everything. She opened the message. There was an audio file attached. Clara pressed play. Her own voice came from the speaker. Thin and distorted but recognizable. I'll keep the money if you keep my name out of it. Her blood went cold. She had never said that. Not like that. Not in that order. She knew instantly what it was, pieces of her voice cut from somewhere else, stitched together into a lie. Below the audio file, Matteo had written, If I fall you fall as my accomplice. Clara stared at the screen. Dante did not reach for her phone. He did not take it from her hand. He waited. That mattered. Finally, Clara turned the screen toward him. Her voice was shaking again. But not from fear this time, from fury. He made me say something I never said. Dante listened to the file once. His face hardened. Then he said the thing Clara already knew. He did not make this alone. By morning, Matteo Vieri had become the injured party. That was how quickly a beautiful liar could move when he had money, polish, and a room full of people willing to believe the cleaner story. Clara woke to 7 missed calls, 12 messages, and 1 email from the community college marked urgent. She had slept for maybe 2 hours. Sitting upright on the sofa with her phone in her hand and the apartment lights on, Ethan had fallen asleep in his room after pretending not to be scared. She had heard him get up twice in the night to check the front door. The email from the college was careful, professional, regretful, due to recent concerns brought to our attention. We believe it is best to temporarily pause your evening Italian course until the matter is clarified. Clara read the sentence 3 times. Recent concerns, the matter, clarified. People love soft words when they were doing hard things to someone else. She sat at the kitchen table in yesterday's clothes, one hand around a mug of coffee she had not tasted. Ethan came in wearing sweatpants and the red hoodie from the photograph. The sight of it hit her so hard she almost told him to change. Instead, she folded the email closed and placed her phone face down. What happened? He asked. Nothing you need to carry before breakfast. That means something bad. Clara looked at him. The college paused my class. Ethan's jaw tightened. Because of him. Because of what he wants people to think about me. That's the same thing. She almost smiled. Sometimes you sound older than you are. I'm old enough to know when people are being cowards. Clara wanted to tell him not to say that. She wanted to tell him the world was complicated, that people had jobs and policies and reputations to protect. But the truth was simpler and uglier. Sometimes institutions did not need to hate you to hurt you. Sometimes they only needed to be afraid of inconvenience. Her phone vibrated again, this time. The number was unknown. but the voicemail appeared almost immediately. Clara did not play it. She forwarded it to Rosa, just as she had been told. A minute later, Rosa called. Do not speak to anyone from the college by phone. Rosa said without greeting, email only, short, polite, and boring. Boring is your friend. Clara closed her eyes. Good morning to you too. Good morning. Mateo filed a complaint. Clara opened her eyes. What kind of complaint? The kind designed to look reasonable from a distance. Theft of confidential business records. Attempted extortion. Harassment after the end of a romantic relationship. The room seemed to narrow. Ethan stepped closer. Clara lifted one hand, telling him not now. Though she already knew he would not leave. Rosa continued, there are documents attached to the complaint with your electronic signature. I didn't assign anything. I know. Rosa, I didn't assign anything. I said I know. The certainty in Rosa's voice kept Clara from breaking the mug in her hand. How? Clara asked. Because the signature timestamps are sloppy. Because one login came from an IP address connected to Mateo's office. And because men like him are usually less clever than they think when they rush. Clara let out a breath that did not feel like relief. So he forged me. He used access he had when you trusted him. Old email, old passwords, possibly old devices. We will have a forensic analyst look at it. Ethan's face had gone pale. He can do that. Clara looked at her son. She hated that the answer was yes. Rosa heard him. Ethan, if you are in the room, listen carefully. Change every password today. Email banking, school portal, phone account, cloud storage. Use different passwords for each. Turn on two-factor authentication. Do not use birthdays, names, teams, pets, or anything Mateo could guess from your mother's life. Ethan took out his phone immediately. That was the first useful thing Fear had done all morning. Across town. Dante received the same information in a private office above a closed dining room. The chairs were still upside down on the tables below. Morning light came through the front windows, pale and unforgiving. Nico stood near the wall with his arms crossed while Rosa spoke from Dante's phone on speaker. When she finished, Nico said, "Give me one night." Dante did not answer. That was enough to make Rosa sharp. No, Nico looked at the phone. I wasn't asking you. You should have been. If you touch Mateo, Clara becomes the woman who ran to criminals because her ex-boyfriend hurt her feelings. Every document she has becomes suspect. Every true thing she says gets dragged through your mud. Nico's mouth tightened. He threatened her kid. Yes, Rosa said. And he is counting on men like you, being too angry to think. Dante stood by the window, looking down at the street, for one dangerous second. He wanted the old solution. It rose in him with familiar ease, a car, a warehouse. A man tied to a chair, who suddenly remembered all the things he thought he could hide. It would be quick. It would also ruin Clara. That was the part he held on to. No, Dante said. Nico turned. Boss, no, you letting him win. Dante looked at him then. No, I'm refusing to win his way. Nico looked away first. Later that afternoon, Clara drove to the community college parking lot because sitting at home made the walls feel too close. She did not go inside. She only parked beneath a maple tree that had already lost half its leaves and stared at the building where she used to teach people how to pronounce beautiful words. Italian had once been joy to her. Before Mateo, it had been music, travel history, food, poetry, old films. Grandmother stories from students who wanted to find their way back to family. After Mateo, the language had become a hallway where his voice waited at the end. Now the college had paused her class. Paused. As if her life were a video someone else could stop until it became convenient again. Her phone buzzed with a text from Matteo. Vedi. Nessuno deve toccarti per distruggerti. See, no one has to touch you to destroy you. Clara stared at the message until the words stopped being words and became proof. Then, very carefully, she took a screenshot with the date visible. She sent it to Rosa. She saved it in 2 folders. She forwarded it to the private email account Mateo did not know existed. Only after all that did she allow herself to cry. Not loudly. Not beautifully, just one hand over her mouth in the front seat of an old car. With dead leaves collecting against the windshield and the building that no longer trusted her standing in front of her like a polite stranger. Across the street, Dante watched from the back seat of a black sedan. Nico sat behind the wheel, silent. Do we go to her? Nico asked. Dante watched Clara lower her head. No. She's alone. No, Dante said. She has a right to a moment that does not belong to us. Nico did not understand. Dante could feel that. Years ago, he would not have understood either. He would have mistaken intrusion for care, possession for protection, control for love. But Clara had been controlled enough. So Dante stayed where he was, close enough to come if she called, far enough to let her remain herself. That evening, Rosa came to Dante's office with a folder thick enough to change the temperature in the room. She placed it on his desk. I found the problem, she said. Dante opened it. There were names, dates, internal processing notes, copies of documents that should not have moved as fast as they had. Matteo's complaint had been reviewed before it was officially filed. Someone inside a legal or investigative office had helped him prepare the ground before Clara even knew the trap existed. Dante read for a long time. Nico leaned forward. What does that mean? Rosa answered before Dante could. It means Matteo is not only hiding behind money, he is hiding behind institutions. Dante closed the folder. That was worse. A man hiding in an alley could be pulled into the light. A man hiding behind paperwork, official stamps, and polite emails could ruin someone while everyone thanked him for following procedure. Dante looked at Rosa. Can we prove it? Not yet. Then we get proof. Rosa nodded. Clean proof. Dante understood the warning. His phone lit up with a forwarded screenshot from Clara. Matteo's latest message. No one has to touch you to destroy you. Dante read it twice. Then he turned the phone around so Nico could see it. Nico's face darkened. Dante said, "This is what he wants us to feel, angry, careless." Nico looked at the screen again, and for once, he said nothing, in her apartment. Clara placed her phone on the kitchen table and opened a new notebook. On the first page, she wrote the date. Then she wrote one sentence beneath it. He wants me to react. She paused, breathing through the ache in her chest. Then she wrote another. I will respond instead. The difference was small. It was also the first piece of ground she had taken back. The scholarship email arrived at 7:14 the next morning, while Ethan was standing barefoot in the kitchen, eating cereal from a mixing bowl because every normal bowl was still in the dishwasher. At first, Clara almost smiled. It looked like the kind of email mothers prayed for and pretended not to pray for too loudly. A private foundation. A merit-based award. Enough money to cover most of Ethan's first year. The subject line said congratulations, and for one foolish second, Clara let herself imagine a different morning. One where good news was only good news. One where a door opened without a hand waiting behind it. Then she saw the foundation name. Vieri Family Cultural Fund. The spoon slipped from Ethan's hand and hit the bowl with a dull clink when he saw her face. What? Clara did not answer right away. She read the email again, slower this time, searching for some ordinary explanation. Maybe Matteo had donated to dozens of organizations. Maybe the name meant nothing. Maybe she had become so trained to see danger that she could no longer recognize kindness. But that was how men like Matteo survived. They taught you to doubt your own alarm. It is connected to him, she said. Ethan looked at the screen. Matteo. Yes, his expression hardened. I didn't apply for this, I know. Then how did they get my school email? Clara closed the laptop halfway, as if the message itself could look back at them. That is exactly the question. Ethan pushed away from the counter. So now he says messing with my college. He says trying to make sure we know he can. That's not the same thing as actually being able to. Clara looked at him, tired suddenly in a way sleep could not fix. Ethan, when a man wants control, he does to always start by breaking down the door. Sometimes he just leaves his hand on the handle so you can see it. Her son looked away first. He hated being afraid. Clara understood that. Young men often mistook fear for weakness because no one had taught them fear could be information. Matteo knew that too. He knew exactly where to press. Not hard enough to leave proof, just hard enough to make the whole house flinch. By noon, Rosa had the email. By 1, Dante knew. By 2, a quiet investigation had begun into the foundation, its donors, and the path that had carried Ethan's name into Matteo's reach. But the damage had already entered the apartment. Ethan moved through the rest of the day, like a person trying to prove he was not being moved. He answered Clara's questions with short words. He kept his phone face down. He checked the window twice and pretended he was only looking at the weather. when Clara asked him to text before leaving campus. He stared at her as if the request itself were a chain. "I'm not a glass vase," he said at last. Clara was folding laundry at the kitchen table. She stopped with one of his t-shirts in her hands. "I never said you were. You act like I'll shatter if I know too much." "No," she said, and the force in her own voice surprised both of them. "I act like you are the one thing I cannot afford to lose." The anger left his face too quickly. That was the problem with honest pain. It ended arguments before anyone was ready to stop being angry. Ethan swallowed. "I just want to help. I know. No, you don't. You want me to wait. You want me to stay inside whatever plan you and Dante and that lawyer are making. Because plans keep people alive. Or they keep people scared." Clara did not answer fast enough. By evening, Ethan was at the campus library again. Clara had let him go, because stopping him would have made the apartment feel like a prison. And because Rosa had reminded her that fear should not be allowed to make every decision. Ethan promised to stay on the main floor. He promised to keep his phone on. He promised to call before walking home. At 8:32, he texted her a picture of his open textbook. At 8:47, he received a message from an unknown account. "I have proof that can help your mother. Don't tell anyone. People are watching her." He should have ignored it. He knew that. Later, he would tell himself he knew it even then. But knowing a thing and obeying it are different. Especially when you are 18 and afraid your mother has been carrying a war alone. The message gave a location near the train station, 2 blocks from campus. Ethan left the library through the side door. At 9:05, Clara called him. No answer. At 9:07 she called again. No answer. At 9:08, the world narrowed to the sound of her own breathing. For 3 seconds, she was not in her kitchen. She was back in the restaurant. Hearing Mateo's voice in her ear, "Your son will disappear before the check arrives." Her hand went cold around the phone. Then she saw the notebook on the table. "He wants me to react, I will respond instead." Clara forced herself to move. She called campus security and gave Ethan's name, description, and last known location. She sent Rosa a screenshot of his last text. She opened the family location app Ethan hated and found the last ping near the library's west exit. Then she called Dante. He answered immediately. "Ethan left the library," she said. "His phone isn't answering. Last location was West Campus, near the train station." Dante did not waste time comforting her. "How long? Maybe 20 minutes. Stay home, keep your phone in your hand, send me the location, I am coming." "No," he said. The word struck something raw in her. Dante heard it too. His voice changed before she could speak. "I advise you not to. If this is a lure, he may want you out of the apartment and panicked, but it is your choice." Clara closed her eyes. He had corrected himself. Even now. "I hate this," she whispered. "I know, no." A pause, then, quietly. "I know what it is to be too young to protect the person you love." That stopped her. "Find my son," she said. "I will." Dante and Nico found Ethan 26 minutes later, near the south entrance of the train station. Standing under a broken light with his hood up and shame already written across his face. The person who had messaged him was gone. There was no proof anyone had been there at all, except Ethan's fear and the security camera above the corner store. Nico got out first, angry enough to fill the street. Dante raised one hand, and Nico stopped. Ethan looked from one man to the other. "I know, I was stupid." Dante stepped closer, but not too close. "You were brave for the wrong person's plan," he said. Ethan frowned. "You wanted to protect your mother. That is honorable. But courage without information is a door your enemy can open." Ethan's face changed, not because he liked being corrected, because Dante had not made him feel small. When Clara saw Ethan walk through the apartment door 40 minutes later, the strength went out of her legs. She grabbed him and held him so hard he complained, but his voice cracked when he did. "I am sorry," he said into her shoulder. Clara pulled back and took his face in both hands. "No, I am sorry too. For what? For making you guess what I was afraid of." He blinked fast. "Were you scared?" "Yes." "How do you keep standing?" Clara looked at him. At the boy she had tried so hard to protect from fear that she had nearly left him alone with it. "Fear does not mean stop," she said. "It means step carefully." Later that night, Rosa traced the unknown message. It had bounced through false accounts, but the design was clear. Mateo had not only wanted Ethan outside, He had wanted Clara to panic, if she had stormed into Mateo's restaurant screaming, if she had threatened him, if she had been filmed looking wild and unstable. He would have had exactly the woman he was trying to sell to the world. A hysterical mother, a bitter ex, a liar under pressure. Dante stood in Clara's kitchen when Rosa explained it over the phone. Ethan sat beside his mother, silent for once. Clara listened until the end, then she looked at Dante. "He didn't want me silent," she said. Dante nodded. "He wanted you unbelievable." The sentence should have broken something in her. Instead, it clarified the room. Clara reached for her notebook and opened to a new page. "What are you writing?" Ethan asked. She picked up her pen. "The rules," she said. Dante watched her write, and for the first time since the restaurant, Clara did not look like a woman being hunted. She looked like a woman learning the shape of the trap and preparing to turn it around. By morning, Clara had written 3 pages of rules. Not emotional rules, not the kind people make after heartbreak. When they swear they will never answer a certain number again, and then answer it anyway, because grief has a memory of its own. These were practical rules, hard rules, the kind that could be followed when fear made the mind slippery. Do not answer unknown calls. Do not respond to Mateo directly. Do not go anywhere without telling someone. Do not let anger make the first decision. Do not meet him alone. Do not give him a version of me he can sell. Clara stared at that last sentence longer than the others. It felt like the center of everything. Mateo did not only want to scare her, he wanted to shape how other people saw her. The unstable woman, the bitter ex, the desperate mother, the thief, the liar, the woman who could not let go. For years, he had tried to edit her in private. Now he was trying to publish the edited version. Rosa arrived at Clara's apartment at 9 with a leather briefcase, 2 coffees, and the expression of a woman who had already been awake for 4 hours. Dante came with her, but he stayed near the window while Rosa took the chair across from Clara. Ethan sat on the sofa, arms crossed, pretending he was only there because his mother made him stay. No one believed that. Rosa opened her briefcase and placed 3 folders on the table. "We stop reacting," she said. "From now on, we build." Clara looked at the folders. "Build what?" "A path he thinks belongs to him." Dante's eyes moved from the window to Rosa. He knew that tone. It was the tone she used when she had decided everyone in the room was going to survive by becoming less stupid. Rosa tapped the first folder. Layer 1. You cooperate with any investigator only through counsel. No casual conversations. No helpful explanations in hallways. No emotional phone calls. If someone wants your statement, they get it in writing, with me present. She tapped the second folder. Layer 2. We bring in a forensic analyst. The fake audio, the electronic signatures, the login timestamps. Mateo created paper. We create proof. Then she touched the third folder, slower than the others. Layer 3. We give Mateo a room where he thinks he can control the conversation. Clara understood before Rosa finished. "You want me to meet him?" "No," Rosa said. "I want you to understand the option. You do not have to do it." Dante said nothing. That silence mattered. Clara felt it. He was not pushing her. He was not saving her. He was leaving the decision where it belonged. Even though every line of his body said he hated the thought of Mateo in the same room with her. Ethan leaned forward. "Absolutely not." Clara looked at him gently. "You don't get to decide for me either." He opened his mouth, then closed it. The lesson hurt. Clara saw it land. Rosa continued. "If you choose to meet him, it will not be alone in any meaningful sense. Recording laws checked, cameras accounted for. A trusted federal contact nearby. Dante and his people close enough to intervene, but not close enough to become the story." Dante's jaw tightened. Clara noticed. "So he wants you to react too," she said. Dante looked at her. "Yes, and if you do, I lose." He did not soften the truth. "Yes." That afternoon, Dante went to see Father Alden Walsh in a small brick church on the west side. The kind of church that had survived neighborhood changes, scandals, winter storms, and generations of men who came in only when guilt grew teeth. Father Walsh was old now, with tired eyes and hands that shook slightly when he poured coffee. He had known Dante's mother. Long before Dante became the kind of man other men lowered their voices around. "I want to hurt him," Dante said. Father Walsh did not look surprised. "Of course you do. I could. That is usually the problem with powerful men. Dante looked at the stained glass window above the empty pews. Blue light fell across the floor like water. When I was a boy, he said, I heard my father threaten my mother in Italian. People sat 10 feet away and smiled because they thought it was passion. I understood every word. I did nothing. You were a child. I am not a child now. No, Father Walsh said. And that is why you must choose better than the child inside you wants to choose. Dante turned back to him. The priest's voice was gentle, but not weak. Action is not always force. Dante, sometimes restraint is the first honest thing a violent man ever learns. Before nightfall, Nico nearly ruined everything. He had followed one of Matteo's men too closely near a parking garage behind a wine distributor. The man had noticed. Words were exchanged. Nico had not touched him, but he had stepped close enough, smiled coldly enough, and said enough without saying it that anyone watching would understand. And someone had been watching. The video arrived on Dante's phone 20 minutes later. Your dog bites before you do. Dante found Nico in the back office of a closed restaurant and played the video without speaking. Nico watched it once, then looked away. I was protecting you, Nico said. Dante's voice was quiet. That made it worse. That sentence has destroyed more lives than hate. Nico stiffened. Dante stepped closer. Loyalty is not doing whatever your anger wants. Loyalty is making sure the person you serve does not pay for your mistake. Nico's face flushed. He threatened her kid, and now he has footage of my man threatening his. You gave him exactly what he wanted. For once. Nico had no answer. That evening, Clara returned to her empty classroom at the community college. Officially, her class was still paused. Unofficially, she still had a key. And the old security guard at the front desk had pretended not to see her walk in. She stood before the whiteboard with a marker in her hand. For a long time, she wrote nothing. Then, slowly she wrote 3 sentences in Italian. Non ho paura di te, I am not afraid of you. Non mi possiedi. You do not own me. Io dico la verità, I tell the truth. The first time she read them aloud, her voice shook. The second time, it steadied. The third time, she was not practicing pronunciation. She was teaching her body a new memory. Her phone buzzed on the desk. A message from Matteo. Come to the restaurant, alone. I can make all of this disappear. Clara looked at the words until her heartbeat slowed. Then she forwarded the message to Rosa, then to Dante. A minute later, Dante called. You do not have to do this, he said. I know, if you choose it, we do it your way. Clara looked at the 3 sentences on the board. No, she said. We do it the right way. Dante was silent for a moment. Then he said, then we build the room before he walks into it. Clara capped the marker and turned off the classroom lights. For the first time since Matteo had whispered in her ear, she did not feel like prey. She felt like a woman studying the trap from the outside, and tomorrow she would decide where the door belonged. The restaurant looked different when Clara walked into it by choice. Not safer, not kinder, just different. The first time she had stood inside Vieri's after leaving Matteo, she had been working, carrying a clipboard like a shield, trying to disappear into usefulness. Tonight, she wore a dark coat over a simple gray dress, her hair pinned back. Her phone tucked into the inside pocket Rosa had checked twice. There was no clipboard, no name tag. No reason to pretend she belonged to the room. She did not belong to the room. That was the point. Vieri's was nearly empty, though every light had been left on, as if Matteo wanted the place to perform for her. Candles flickered on white tablecloths. Wineglasses stood in perfect rows behind the bar. The air smelled of garlic, lemon, polished wood, and memory. For a second, Clara remembered the first time Matteo brought her here. Back when charm still felt like generosity, he had ordered for her in Italian, corrected her pronunciation gently, and kissed her hand when she blushed. She had mistaken being studied for being seen. A hostess Clara did not recognize led her toward the back dining room. Clara counted cameras without moving her head, one above the bar, one near the hallway, one in the corner by the wine cabinet. Rosa had already confirmed which cameras were active and which were ornamental. The small recorder beneath Clara's dress collar pressed lightly against her skin. It was legal. It was checked. It was not enough to make her brave, but it gave her fear a job. Matteo stood when she entered. Of course he did. He wore a dark blue suit and a white shirt open at the throat. His face carried the soft concern of a man prepared to be misunderstood. He smiled as if the last week had not happened. As if he had not threatened her son. As if he had not forged her voice into a lie. "Clara," he said. "Thank you for coming." She stopped beside the table. "You said you could make this disappear. I can." He pulled out a chair for her. She looked at it, then chose the chair on the opposite side of the table, the one facing the corner camera. It was a small act, Matteo noticed. His smile thinned. "Still dramatic?" "No," Clara said, "just done being placed, behind the kitchen wall." In a small manager's office crowded with old invoices and security monitors, Dante watched the camera feed without sitting down. Nico stood near the door, restless enough to wear a path into the floor. Rosa stood between them with her phone in one hand and her jaw set like stone. A federal investigator named Marcus Hale waited 2 blocks away with 2 agents and a warrant request ready to move if Matteo said enough. He was not Dante's friend, that was why Rosa trusted him. Nico looked at the screen and muttered, "I don't like this. No one likes this," Rosa said. Dante said nothing, on the monitor. Matteo poured wine Clara did not touch. "You look tired," he said. "I am. That is what happens when you let dangerous people into your life." Clara almost laughed. "You invited me." "I meant Moretti." There it was, faster than she expected. Matteo leaned back, studying her. "Do you think he cares about you?" "Men like Dante Moretti do not rescue women, Clara. They acquire problems. Then they decide whether the problem is useful." Clara kept her hands folded in her lap. "Is that what I was to you?" His expression softened. "Beautifully practiced. You were the woman I loved before you let fear poison your memory." "No, I remember clearly." His eyes sharpened. Then he switched to Italian. "You are embarrassing yourself. You are a tired woman with debts, a son who is already leaving you, and a gangster whispering in your ear because he wants my business." Clara felt the old reflex rise, the shrinking, the urge to explain. The desperate need to make him understand that she was not what he said she was. She let the silence sit. Matteo hated silence when it did not belong to him. "You think that little file matters," he continued in Italian. "You do not even understand what you stole." "I understand enough," Clara said, also in Italian. His face changed. She had spoken Italian to him before, of course, but never like this, not steady. Not without asking permission from his expression. "Tu usi l'italiano per nasconderti," she said. "Io lo userò per dire la verità." "You use Italian to hide, I will use it to tell the truth." In the office, Nico looked at Dante. What did she say? Dante did not take his eyes from the screen. She took the room back. Matteo's smile vanished for half a second. Then he laughed softly. "You think you are clever because Rosa Whittaker told you where to sit and what to say." Clara's heart kicked once. He knew about Rosa. Matteo leaned closer. "Do you think I did not expect him to listen? Do you think I did not know Dante would put men nearby? That is the trouble with powerful men. They are predictable when a woman gives them a reason to feel righteous." Clara said nothing. Matteo's voice lowered. "He wants to hurt me. I want him to try." In the office, Nico cursed under his breath. Rosa looked at Dante. "He is baiting you." Dante's face was unreadable, but one hand had closed around the back of the chair in front of him. On the screen, Matteo continued, "If Moretti touches me, threatens me, sends one of his dogs after me, I hand over everything, names, routes, accounts, old connections. I become useful to people who want him more than they want me." Clara understood then. The room tilted, then steadied. She was not only Matteo's target, she was bait. "You used my son to pull him closer," she said. Matteo smiled. "I used your son to remind you of your place." The sentence changed the air. Clara looked at him. "Say that again." His eyes narrowed. "What? What you said at the charity dinner, in Italian, about Ethan." Matteo sat back. "You already know what I said. I want to hear it clearly." "No. You want a performance, I want the truth." That was when he reached across the table and took her wrist. Not hard enough to bruise immediately. Hard enough to hurt. Hard enough to remind her that under the suit, under the charity speeches, under the perfect manners, Matteo had always believed her body was a thing he could correct. In the office, Nico moved. Dante caught his arm before he reached the door. Nico turned on him, furious. He touched her. Wait, he touched her. Dante's voice dropped. "And if you go in first, he wins," on the monitor. Clara did not pull away. Her face had gone pale, but her voice held. "Say it." Matteo leaned in, anger finally breaking through the polish. Sorridi. Clara, he hissed in Italian. Se fai una scena, tuo figlio spazzerà prima che arrivi il conto. E se non firmi quello che ti do, posso ancora farlo. Smile, Clara. If you make a scene, your son will disappear before the check arrives. And if you do not sign what I give you, I can still do it. The door opened, not violently, not dramatically, just firmly. Marcus Hale entered first, badge visible. 2 agents followed. Dante came behind them, calm and untouched by the trap Matteo had built for him. Matteo released Clara's wrist. For the first time all evening he looked surprised. Hale spoke first. Matteo Vieri. Keep your hands where I can see them. Matteo's eyes moved past him to Dante. You want to touch me. Dante looked at Clara before he answered. She was standing now, one hand around her sore wrist, but her eyes were clear. Then Dante looked back at Matteo. No, he said. That was the first thing you misunderstood about power. As the agents moved in, Matteo's face twisted. The mask did not fall all at once. It cracked in pieces. He turned toward Clara. You think this ends with me, he said. Ask Moretti who protected my money. The words landed harder than Clara expected. Dante did not move, but something in his silence changed. And Clara, who had spent years learning to hear what men tried not to say, knew one thing immediately. Matteo was not finished telling the truth. He had only started bleeding it. Matteo Vieri did not break after his arrest. That was the first thing Clara learned about men like him. They could be caught, exposed, humiliated, even handcuffed in front of the people they had spent years impressing. And still, they would search the room for a way to turn the story. Matteo's mask had cracked inside the restaurant, but by morning, his lawyers were already polishing the pieces. Rosa called Clara before 9. Do not celebrate yet, she said. Clara was sitting at the kitchen table with Ethan across from her, both of them too tired to pretend they had slept. Her wrist still ached where Matteo had grabbed her, a faint mark beginning to show beneath the skin. Ethan kept looking at it and then looking away, as if the bruise accused him of not being there. What happened? Clara asked. Matteo is talking. Good, not entirely. Rosa's voice was flat. He is offering names, routes, accounts, and old business connections. He is trying to trade himself down. Clara looked toward the window. Chicago moved outside like nothing had happened. Buses sighed. Cars honked, somewhere below. A woman laughed into a phone. Then Rosa said, some of those connections touched Dante's organization. The apartment went quiet, across town. Dante stood in his office while Rosa placed a file on his desk. Nico was there. So was Sal Greer, an old loyalist with white hair, a thick neck, and the tired arrogance of a man who had survived too long to believe consequences applied to him. Dante opened the file. Transport companies, Shell payments, protected shipments, Matteo S. Restaurant imports had moved through routes Dante thought were dead. Handled by men Dante thought had accepted the new order. His eyes stopped on one name, Salvatore Greer. Nico turned sharply. Sal. Sal did not deny it. That was almost worse. Dante looked up slowly. You protected Matteo's money. I protected our people, Sal said. No. You protected a man who threatened a woman and her son. Sal's jaw tightened. You think clean books feed old soldiers. You think legitimacy pays the men who bled for your father. Matteo's money kept doors open. My father is dead, and so is the family he built. If you keep cutting pieces off it. The room held its breath. For years, Dante had believed betrayal would announce itself with greed, fear, or hatred. But Sal looked at him with something that resembled grief. That made it harder. A man could be wrong, and still believe himself loyal. A man could poison a house while insisting he was keeping it warm. Rosa spoke from beside the desk. You can bury this. Dante did not look at her. She continued. Matteo can still be charged. Clara can still be cleared. Sal's connection does not have to become public unless you choose to make it public. Nico stared at her. You retelling him to hide it. I am telling him the choice. Dante closed the file. Later that afternoon, Clara met him in a small church parking lot, away from his men and her apartment, and the rooms where other people kept trying to decide what truth was worth. He looked older than he had the night before, not weaker, just more human. I don't want you destroying your life for me, Clara said. Dante looked at the church doors. This stopped being only about you the moment I heard him, and chose not to pretend identity. Then make sure you read doing this for the truth, she said. Not for me, not because of your father, not because you want to feel clean. His eyes returned to hers, and if truth costs me men who were loyal. Clara thought of Mateo's hand around her wrist, his soft voice, his perfect lies. Then she thought of all the people who had looked away because looking was inconvenient. Maybe loyalty that needs lies to survive was already broken. The words stayed with Dante long after she left. By evening, he gave Rosa the file. All of it. Not the edited version, not the safe version, not the version that protected old names and buried old rot beneath new money. He gave her the roots, the payments, the companies. And Sal, when Sal realized what Dante had done, his face went hard with wounded disbelief. You'll end up alone, he said. Dante looked at him for a long moment. Maybe, he answered, but not surrounded by lies. The fallout began immediately. Phones rang, old men cursed, deals cracked. Men who had called themselves loyal suddenly remembered other obligations. But Mateo lost his last hiding place. The forged signatures were exposed. The fake audio was traced. The recording from the restaurant confirmed the threat against Ethan in Mateo's own voice. And when Clara walked out of the courthouse 2 days later, cleared but exhausted, she did not feel victorious. She felt real. Mateo stood near the steps between two officers, no smile left on his face. For the first time since she had known him, he looked at Clara as if he could not decide who she was without his permission. Clara held his gaze, then she walked past him. Not quickly, not fearlessly, just freely. 6 months later, Clara Bennett stood in front of a classroom again. It was not a grand room. The chairs did not match. One fluorescent light hummed softly above the back row, and the whiteboard still carried the faint gray shadows of lessons, erased too quickly. Outside the windows, Chicago moved through an ordinary Thursday evening, all brake lights, wet sidewalks, and people hurrying home with their collars turned up against the wind. Clara held a marker in her hand and looked at the students waiting for her to begin. Some were young, some were retired. One woman said she wanted to learn Italian before visiting the village where her grandmother had been born. A man in the front row said he only wanted to order dinner in Rome without sounding like a fool. They laughed at that, and Clara smiled. For the first time in a long while, the sound did not feel like armor. She turned to the board and wrote 4 words. Io ti credo. Then she faced the class. It means, I believe you, she said. No one knew why her voice softened around the sentence. No one knew about the restaurant, or the recording, or the photograph under the door, or the man who had once used beautiful words to hide ugly things. They only saw their teacher pause for a moment before continuing. Sometimes, Clara said, that is the first sentence a person needs before they are brave enough to say the next one. Across the city, Ethan was learning how to live away from home. His dorm room was too messy, his calls were too short, and his laundry standards had fallen in ways Clara tried not to think about. But he was happy, truly happy. The kind of happy that made a mother ache and heal at the same time. On the day he left, he had asked her, "Are you going to be okay alone?" Clara had folded one of his shirts and placed it in the suitcase. "I was never weak because I was afraid," she told him. "I was just tired." Ethan had looked at her then, no longer as a child looking up, but as a young man finally seeing the woman who raised him. "Are you still tired?" "Sometimes." And then, Clara smiled, "Then I rest. I didn't go back to the people who made me tired." Dante Moretius' life had changed too. He had sold businesses that could not survive honest books. He had closed routes that should have been buried years before. Men who once called themselves loyal stopped answering his calls. Others stayed, quieter than before, because they understood that something old had ended and something harder had begun. His office was smaller now. The carpets were less expensive. There were fewer men outside the door. Rosa Whittaker visited one afternoon, looked around, and said, "You look poorer." Dante stood by the window, watching trucks move along the street below. "I sleep better." Rosa smiled, "Careful. That almost sounds healthy." He almost smiled back. A week after Clara's first class, she met Dante at a small Italian restaurant neither of them owned. No private room, no bodyguards in sight, no performance, just a table near the window and rain moving softly against the glass. "How is your son?" Dante asked. "Happy," Clara said, "which means he calls less." Dante nodded as if this were a law of nature he had only recently discovered. And you? She asked. He looked at the glass of water in front of him. Less powerful. Is that bad? He thought about it. Not as bad as I expected. There was tenderness between them, but neither of them rushed to name it. They were not children. They did not need to turn survival into romance just to make it feel meaningful. Some connections were strong because they were not greedy. Clara looked at him across the table. Thank you for hearing him that night. Dante's eyes stayed on hers. Thank you for answering him. When they left, the rain had slowed. Near the door, a man at another table leaned toward his wife and said something sharp in Italian. Low enough that most of the room missed it. The woman's eyes dropped to her plate. Clara heard it, so did Dante, this time. Clara did not freeze. She simply turned and looked at the woman. Not with pity, not with pressure, just recognition. A look that said, I heard it too. Dante stood beside her, silent. The man at the table stopped speaking. The woman lifted her eyes, and that was where the story truly ended. Not with a gunshot, not with revenge, not with a kiss in the rain. It ended with a threat no longer alone in the dark. He thought Italian would hide the cruelty. He thought a crowded room was the safest place to be cruel. He thought Clara would smile, lower her eyes, and carry one more secret home. But the mafia boss next to her understood every word, and more importantly, so did she. Because the day a woman stops translating her fear into silence is the day a man like Matteo starts losing power. Not every victory is loud. Some begin with one witness, one sentence, one woman finally saying, in any language she chooses, no more. This book is a work of imagination. Names, characters, places, and incidents either are products of the author's creativity or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to real persons or actual events is unintentional and should not be construed as factual representation.
The meaning of this story is not simply that a mafia boss saved a woman from a dangerous man. That would be too easy. The deeper lesson is that real strength does not always arrive with violence, loud words, or revenge. Sometimes real strength begins when one person hears the truth and refuses to look away. Clara's story reminds us that fear does not make a person weak. Many people survive quietly for years, not because they lack courage, but because they are trying to protect someone they love. Clara was afraid, but she was not helpless. She kept records, she made copies, she learned to breathe before reacting. She understood that panic can be used against you, but wisdom can become a weapon. Dante's lesson is different. He had power, he had men. He had the ability to destroy Matteo in the old way. But the story shows us that true authority is not measured by how quickly a man can punish an enemy. True authority is measured by discipline. Dante became stronger when he chose restraint over rage, truth over pride, and protection without control. Matteo represents a very real kind of danger. Not every cruel person looks cruel. Some wear perfect suits, speak softly, donate to charities, and smile in public. That is why we must learn to listen carefully, trust patterns more than appearances, and believe people when they finally find the courage to speak. The moral of this story is simple but powerful. Never confuse silence with weakness, and never confuse control with love. A person who truly protects you will not take your voice away. They will stand beside you until you are ready to use it. In the end, Clara was not saved because someone spoke for her. She was saved because someone heard her, believed her, and helped her speak for herself.